Hey everyone, it is Thursday, February 18th of 2021, and we are talking about slippers, releases, and versioning. Um, so we've been talking in an MR where we started working on some of the documentation and the infrastructure for this. And I'll share my screen to show the agenda. Um, there we go. So yeah, we were talking about what we're releasing, how we're releasing it, what we're versioning, how we're versioning it, etc. And wanted to record just sort of a conversation between the three of us, sound like bigger picture sort of things for other folks to refer to, and we can use as reference material and other documentation. So I'll kick us off here. In the agenda, there's a couple links to the documentation, the MR that I was talking about. Javi had shared with us this releasing design systems post, which is honestly like for the most part, I think this first iteration, I just like copied the things that were relevant because I thought that like it made a lot of sense. I thought it was great. Thanks for finding the resource, by the way, Javi, and thanks for sharing it. I thought it was awesome, and it felt like super applicable to our goals and what we want to get out of it. So I basically just grabbed the things that apply to us, and then I left in the MR open questions. And for me, I feel very comfortable about the what code is getting released and versioned and how. And I just do not have the context for design assets and what that's like. So I know you two have the experience there to help fill in those gaps for me, or at least point us in the right direction to get started with these conversations. So I think we can take care of the easy part first, which is releasing and versioning the code that is slippers, right? And so just looking at, I don't have slippers open, but I will, I won't waste time finding it. When it comes to releasing and versioning our component library, there's basically like two things that we are going to version and release. The first is, and they kind of come as a set, but the nice thing is that we do have them decoupled so they can be used, they can be applied differently. The first is the compiled CSS, what our post CSS pulls out of Tailwind and pulls out of our custom CSS. Thank you, Javi, for the link. Appreciate it. This is the code base itself, right? And when we release and version things, they turn into these assets here that can be consumed by different package managers, right? So compile CSS is one of them, and then our Vue.js library bundle. And so that is our compiled CSS. And all of these files are different iterations on that compiled Vue.js component bundle. We don't need to talk too much about the differences there, but just know that they're basically set up to be imported in different contexts if we need to. It gives us a lot of flexibility with how the package gets used. So that's what we're releasing and what we are versioning. The way that we are versioning is pretty standard across software development, semantic versioning, which in itself is well versioned and well maintained, and GitLab uses it. And it's you know, for folks who've been working with specific versioning, I think it's easy to conceptualize. It's a little bit different than like what, if you're not familiar with it, it's useful to think about like there's three numbers, right? There is an X, a Y, and a Z. I have an example here, 0.Y.Z. You'll see this in a lot of software versioning. And it basically, you can think of it as the words major, minor, and patch. And so the idea is that the major version includes things that are incompatible with other major versions. So things that if you were to like, if you had, you know, V1 of slippers, 1 dot whatever, and you move to V2, they would be incompatible. Something would break if you tried to use the same code between the two of them. The minor version is not breaking. So 1.1, 1.2, they should work together. And the minor version is usually just there to denote that something has been added, a new feature, a new functionality, something extra, right? And then the patch, again, is not breaking changes and is just for bug fixes. So it's to fix things that broke, not in the sense of like incompatibilities between major versions, but actual bugs. And so that gives us a fine grain way to really denote like when we release this software, when it goes out into the world to be consumed elsewhere, how are we telling people like what state it is in, and how do we refer back to that in and of ourselves? Semantic versioning requires a little bit of normalization. It requires some process and overhead. And in early development phases, which is where we're at with Slippers, the recommendation for a version 0 is that you stay on version 0. You don't increment 0, 1, 2, 3 in the major column. And you basically say version 0 is unstable. Things will break between our minor versions. And then you just increment your minor version as you make changes. For us, there's a cadence that I think will work really well. We're already working in 2-week sprints. And so I think, basically incrementing our minor version to be in sync with our sprints is the way to move forward. And we can use our patches. So at the end of each sprint, we release the package to the package registry and we say, here's the new version, 0.4, 0.5, so on and so forth. In the middle of a sprint, in the middle of those 2 weeks, if we need to upgrade, say we're using the package elsewhere and we've made a bug fix, we can use the patch version to basically say, here's the fix and now it's consumable. We don't need to upgrade the minor version. So this also, again, it's standardized in kind of software work. So people looking at this, when they see V0, they'll say, oh, like I shouldn't depend on this always working between minor upgrades, right? And so it's a really good way to communicate to external folks or potential collaborators about the state of the version. And then finally, managing it automatically. Like I said, we've got a cadence of doing this at the end of each sprint iteration. And to that end, we can automate it with GitLab CI/CD. I pushed up some automation at the end of last sprint, which broke. It is still broken. I haven't yet fixed it. I'll fix it by the end of this one. Right now, we're basically like manually incrementing the versions and publishing it to NPM. And we can sort of remove that requirement and remove the possible human error from it by setting it up to basically get released on a schedule, or at least have like a 1-button deploy where we say, cool, we're feeling good about this release, time for it to go out into the world. So that's what I had for this. That's kind of, that is the extent of the things that I feel very confident on, and that I have like stronger, like reasoned opinions about. And I'd love to, like, if either of you two have questions about those items, or we can also just move on. Javi, you've got points here that we can get to.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just gonna go through the points because it doesn't seem like we have
Great.
any super crazy questions. Something that I kind of wanted to bring up was just like the concept of sustaining past versions within Git itself. We can do that through the npm package, obviously, because there's like different versioning within that itself. I was wondering if it made sense for us to do so, because I know that Pajamas in particular has something like that.
When you say sustaining, do you mean like maintaining and like fielding requests about, or just like continuing to host?
I think more like continuing to host.
Right, that makes sense.
In my head.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like where my head is at for that. There's also like the related note of packages going out of date. As software moves, things will change, and so having something set up where non-breaking changes can be automatically updated would be really nice, especially as we have all of these packages, they're flying in and out.
Yeah, we certainly, by default, those old versions will stay in the registry. And you mentioned here the tags and releases, GitLab features, which we can dog food and use as well for this. So the answer is like, absolutely, we should. I think that there's, it's good to know, it's good to do, it's good to start. I think in major version 0, as we're going through rapid development, it's less critical in a lot of ways. I think like, it needs to always work. Like if you point a package to a version number that has been published in the past, like it must be available. And if it's not, that's a huge problem. And it's a failure on the promises that we're making as software maintainers here. But again, for version 0, it's a little more like once we hit version 1 and once it becomes stable, I think that like revisiting this conversation and thinking about like guardrails is like, that's when it becomes extremely important to make sure that we're doing the right thing there and we're doing right by people who are relying on us as a dependency.
Yeah, just on that, I think it's good for us to be, supportive of previous versions as the system gets built bigger and more diverse and more robust. But one thing that might serve us in the realms of success is to, incentivize teams to make sure that they're, never more than, 2 or 3 versions away from the most recent, because the further they get away, the more expensive that, or more critical that can become. We run into breaking changes. We run into people being upset about how things have happened when they begin to merge things, and that can cause friction that we don't really want to do, because ultimately this has to sort of serve a purpose. So we can set forth, an ideal cadence that we want to adopt of, like, hey, you're now 2 versions or 3 versions behind, or whatever it is. It might be an idea to begin to think about adopting the code to make sure that you're not too far off, because that's where things can get problematic. It sets ourselves up for a degree of success as well by managing that expectation, because if we leave it hanging and teams never really adopt anything because they just become familiar with it, it could really, become an issue in the future.
Okay. And I had one quick other point about that. I don't know, within the GitLab UI, you can have like a storage space. So if you go to the very top, there's like that. What does that actually mean? Because it just points to, is it talking about like branches, or like, I actually just had that question that I was just confused about. I was looking at it one day. It didn't make that much sense to me.
I don't know off the top of my head. My guess would be, I'm sure this is documented in the GitLab interface. Looking at the differential between these two, where we've got 2 megabytes of files and then 270 megabytes of storage, I would guess that your guess is right, that like the storage listing has to do with all of the metadata that this project sitting in the Rails instance of GitLab, like how much space is it taking up on disk. And then the 2 megabytes of files is, if I were to pull this down to a computer that didn't already have it, how much, what's the size of that payload? That's my guess. I don't see there's not a quick explainer on these things in the UI, and I don't know more.
Okay.
So something
sure.
those we can definitely circle back to that and look it up. And yeah.
Okay, sweet. I want to talk a little bit also about like Figma releases. I think where we ended up on this is just kind of like we were trying to figure out like what would make sense from a design perspective. Like, what's following semantic versioning makes sense, just because we're doing it in the code and it makes sense to try to follow it. I got to the opinion that in my head, it seemed like it was probably going to be overkill for what we're doing, just because the workflow doesn't lend itself too nicely to what designers actually do day to day. I just wanted to hear Steven's thoughts, which is perfect segue. I know you really want to speak. Yeah.
No, it's all good. So in terms of a seamless experience across code and Figma, I would prefer to adopt the same naming convention that we have for the code repo. We did that at previous companies and it was quite successful. It kept designers and developers on the same page, that they're working from the same file, or they're working from the same version at least. I do hear what you say when it comes to, it might be overkill, something like that. I agree. However, I think the overkill in this instance is worth it because of the pain it saves us in the future by having to refer back to what is the most referred to Figma file in existence, or library, for instance. And I think that if we adopt that, and we can have that, we can name release patches and just sequence them, even if there's no patch or bug fix. If they're kept in sequence, it saves us any kind of potential mitigation around confusion. What might happen? What's the latest? We try and treat it all as the same, because it's all part of the same package. Figma is kind of tied into the code. It's just not as glamorous, perhaps. It's a bit more basic, but as other teams potentially begin to use this and lean on it a bit more, and rely on it a bit more, it's important for us to treat them in and of the same. So it doesn't have to be, there's different ways as well in which we can manage that, and we don't rely too much on the tool itself. So we set up support channels in Slack. We release, or we can automate that. That's Pajamas does that too. Whenever there's a patch, whenever there's a release, And there might be some integration as well with Storybook. So, and it can be changes to the documentation around support. It can be changes from, an example would be accordions, for instance, if we begin to support different media within those. So they're not just static text. It could be text with CTA, it could be a video, it could be a form field, whatever route the UX takes, certain blocks and components would begin to have different support for different media as it goes.
So
Sweet.
is it the case that you can, with like a Figma file or a Figma link as it is, Figma still, I'm used to XD for the most part, but like with a Figma file, can you say like, okay, this is the Flippers Foundation file, version 0.y.z, right? And then you can like change that, and like you have each version of that is available based on like, you can like put it in the URL or something. Is that findable? Is it, or is it just a manual process where we just update the title?
I need to double check on that.
I think I have
because
some.
right now there's a master Figma file that we work from, and then we build the library, and then teams will pull the library into their Figma file. That's how Tina and Jess use it currently. And it's easy to manage that because it's internal. They're on our team, so it's easy to sort of understand any pain points or friction. If it came to it, I know we can sync this sort of thing, like I said, to like Slack communications or emails or whatever it is. It's up to us ultimately to decide what way we want to manage those release notes and that kind of cadence. As long as it mimics each other, we don't release a sketch file or a bug fix, halfway through a sprint if it doesn't align with the code. Ideally, it would be great to keep them all on the same track, so that there's no, the Figma file was updated last week, but the code hasn't been updated. It would be better to keep them within the same ballpark as best we can.
Sorry, like,
no,
I
go
think
ahead.
you're answering the other part of my question, which is like, when we determine when the Figma, so like in the same way that at the end of, on a Thursday for sprint release for the code, I say, okay, like push button, this is the version it is, that's out in the world. At that same moment, we would basically say, awesome, whatever state Figma is also that version, right? Is that the
correct? Yeah. And just to bear in mind as well, there are different release notes that may tie into Figma that we can release through Figma, that might not necessarily need to include the code documentation to mimic that. This is where we have two sort of individual packages, shall we say. Ultimately, then we want to have, there's a release package within Figma, there's a release package in code, but then there's a release package that goes that references both. So there can be code changes and there could be Figma changes if there's a bug, for instance, with something that doesn't respond a certain way. And we can also begin to document certain types of contributions that we might get from different teams as well.
Tyler, I dropped a link. Do you want to, after you're done with that, do you want to open Slippers Foundation, and then in the search, or so click the hamburger, and then in the search, type history, and then show version history, and then I think it'll show you like stuff. I think there's a way to name it. I haven't
it looks
like
if
you
I haven't named it properly yet, so I would ideally we can. I mean, it's not too much of heavy lifting to adopt the naming.
Gotcha.
So.
No, I was going to bring up just really quickly. I wanted to see if there is like a tool or a thing that like names it for you, so you don't have to like name it yourself. I'm wondering if there's a way to like. This is like totally
automate this.
Yeah,
there could be a plugin.
Right.
There could be a plugin
yeah,
for
that's
it.
What I'm saying. Yeah,
right.
Because
this would be the manual thing, right? You can like, I click the plus button in the right hand of the version history, and it's like title it. So we could do, I think we're on like 0.5 or whatever at this point. But we could like do that, and then you could get the release notes here. So that makes a lot of sense, at least as a manual process. And then I don't know enough about the tooling ecosystem, but I would be surprised if there wasn't some kind of scheduler for this.
I'd imagine there is. I know that Pajamas, the Pajamas team did adopt something like that, and it's all synced within Slack, not Sketch. So it's just automatic. It's I don't know, some sort of API. I think.
I think there's some merit, especially for if the goal is we want to keep the design assets and the code in sync in versions, there's probably some merit for like not doing entirely automatic. And this goes the same for the code, where it's like, I don't necessarily want to say that whatever it looks like at 2 a.m. Pacific on Thursday is what we're releasing. Like, I think that having sort of the push button, like where we don't have to, I don't want to go in and change all the things, but I want to be able to say like, okay, cool, release the new one, let's go. And like probably same thing here, where, you know, I don't think we want like a strict scheduler that's like, get it in before 2 a.m. or else like that's part of the version now. I think having the ability to have human intervention and say like, yes, we're agreeing this is it, or perhaps, you know, we're delaying this by another week for a good reason, right? Especially once we get into like version 1 and like that, the semantic versioning really takes over and like starts to become much more meaningful than it will in V0.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, right now because it's still quite internal, we're not really reliant on too much feedback from external teams or any kind of contributions just yet. However, that is something that we have to be able to scale the system to support. And once that happens, that's when we're kind of falling into the realm of taking a contribution in some sort of a digital asset along with code. So there can be an argument made for certain times to, you know, if it's a component or a block, let's say, that's very early on in its life, but we do find that it actually has a value for whatever it is, some sort of a widget, for just as an example. We can have the design asset within Figma before it's released in code, and we can add notes. You know, we can control the library different ways within Figma so that designers aren't too hamstrung by waiting on something, especially if it already exists or if they see it in another mockup. You know, we can have that degree of flexibility to support and not hinder, because then we're not serving a positive purpose, so to speak.
Excellent. Cool. Javi, did you have more on that, or do you want to move on to any sort of wrap up and takeaways from the conversation?
No, I think this was wonderful. I did totally misinterpret some of our conversation we had right before this call, but it's perfect. The record button made the truth come out, so I think that's more beneficial for all of us. And I think that's all that I have in specific to that. So
great. Well, cool. Well, thanks, folks, for tuning in. There will be more, and you know, obviously more discussions in MRs, issues, Slack, all the things for the transparency and the collaboration. So really excited to get some more working software out there. Cool. Thanks. I have to stop the share, and then I will stop the recording.